Good evening. Welcome to Interface. My name is Simodisa. Well, Kigali, Rwanda hosted this year's World Economic Forum on Africa, bringing together business, economic and political leaders to discuss the challenges and also the future of Africa. Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa led a high-level government and business delegation to communicate to regional and international investors a positive message that South Africa's macroeconomic environment remains resilient. But are perceptions of Africa changing? How's the current negative global economic environment affecting the continent? These are just some of the questions that we are posing tonight on Interface. And my guests are Matsi Modise, who's the Managing Director of Simodisa, an industry association for South African entrepreneurs. And we're also joined by SABC Senior Reporter Nompumelelo Siziba, who attended the conference in Kigali. And as always, if you would like to take part in this discussion, you can always do so by finding us on social media. On Facebook, it's at Interface on SABC. And on Twitter, at Simodisa and at Interface on SABC. Welcome, ladies. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
What's the changeover like from the heat in Kigali to the cold in Johannesburg?
It's terrible, but
Good.
welcome home.
It's a massive contrast.
I'm sure it is.
Yeah.
But I want to kick off with a statement that came through from one of the commentators. And Nompu, I'm going to pose this to you first. Another year, another World Economic Forum on Africa with many deja vu moments from last year. Is that a fair comment?
I think it is a fair comment because obviously year in, year out, we have the World Economic Forum on Africa and more or less the same themes come up. This year's theme was a bit different in the sense that it was a lot of emphasis on ICT, information, communication and technology, and how that can harness African growth and be an underpin to all the industries that need to grow in the African continent. So, yes, it was different, but the same old issues arise, you know, lack of energy, need for funding.
Infrastructure development.
Yes, infrastructure development, governance, all of those issues keep on arising. And so the question has been, how can we better do these things? I spoke the other day with Deputy Governor Daniel Minele of the Reserve Bank, and you know, I asked him about this issue of funding, for example. He says that he thinks that the issue of money, there isn't a problem of there being no money. It's just about being able to get that money at reasonable rates and rates at which the people who are lending that money can, you know, sort of make a profit, basically. Yeah.
And these are some of the themes that I'd like us to touch on today's show, and also just, you know, look at how the discussion progressed at WEF, and have we even moved on the issues that we know are sticky points for the African continent. But Matsi, did you get the sense that, you know, here we go again, another WEF, you know, and there's nothing really different?
But I think, as in anything, it's always work in progress. But the main themes that came through was, you know, the growth of the continent, the fourth industrial revolution emanating from the Davos conference in January, and also social entrepreneurship. And it was also nice to see that, you know, young people were actually key and core to the discussions and the involvement and participation of young people in the growth of the continent. So I think as a young person, I felt that, you know, we were at the table, we were part of the deliberations, and also highlighting, you know, African young excellence. You know, these are the future leaders of our continent. So it was very good to see that, you know, young Africans were well represented.
Let's look at Rwanda hosting this conference. This is a country with a very turbulent history, as we all know, and it has been able to, in 20 years, transform itself to this, you know, economic hub. And they've done that through, you know, ICT and pushing that forward. What's the significance of having Rwanda hosting WEF on Africa, and what were the key themes that emerged out of that?
I think one of the reasons that it was fitting for Rwanda to hold this particular gathering was the fact that the thrust was about a digital revolution. And they have really hit the nail on the head in terms of trying to make that happen in their country. They spent millions of dollars putting broadband infrastructure all around the country. So it's not just something that you enjoy if you live in town. If you live in rural areas, you also have connectivity. So they've really done a very important thing there. And other African countries were sort of saying, well, Rwanda's done really well. How best can we learn from them? Even South Africa was saying, the Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa was saying that South Africa had so much to learn from Rwanda in that regard.
And just on that point, I mean, South Africa has always known that there was a need to roll out broadband and to actually make the internet in particular more accessible to everybody. That's something that we all know. But what is it that is not happening in this country that's happening in Rwanda and making that so successful?
Well, I think one of the challenges is obviously the broadband nature. So in other words, I think that the broadband infrastructure has only been put in certain places. When you get out into your more rural areas, that's not happening. And in order for there to be economic progress in those regions as well, that's needed. So for example, if you have rural connectivity, if you're a farmer, you're able to communicate with your market at far distances because you're located here in somewhere in Limpopo, for example, but you can communicate with your market in Gauteng about what their needs are and be able to provide those needs and then sort out your logistics in terms of getting the stuff there. But you don't need to physically interface with your market. And that's what the benefit of it is. And we're not there yet here in South Africa. And our telecommunications minister said as much when he was speaking to us the other day.
What are some of the stumbling blocks in your view? How can we get that right?
Well, just to also reiterate what my colleague is saying, I think they have a very profound Vision 2020. And by 2070, 95% of the people in Rwanda will have access to the internet. It's rural by nature. You know, if you go into Kigali, it's one of the cleanest cities, if not the cleanest city in Africa.
Sure.
Rural by nature, but it's so progressive. And also the leadership is very intentional around how do we develop our human capital. So when you ask the question of how are they doing it differently, they have an intentional focus on how do we develop our human capital, because it's not a very naturally rich country. You know, they have
in terms of mineral resources.
In terms of mineral resources. So how are they going to deploy the human capital? How are they going to advance their youth? How are they going to ensure that by a certain point in time, they're able to be the innovative hub of the continent? I mean, they're creating an innovation hub. They're creating an innovation fund. So the ability to actually fund these interventions, you know, they're very intentional about it.
If I may come in there, Tembisa, sure. I mean, that's the thing that's so amazing about Rwanda, that really when it comes to resources, they don't actually have that much. And then you have countries like South Africa, Nigeria, endowed with so much oil, South Africa with so many minerals. We have that already, that comparative advantage. If we now had ICT to harness that, it would mean that you just move so many steps forward relative to a country like Rwanda, which is leading by example.
And that plugs into that buzzword that you threw in earlier, this fourth industrial revolution. Just talk to us a little bit about what that is and what it's likely to look like.
So basically, it's a theme of the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos. Basically, the focus was the fourth industrial revolution. It's how technology has taken over, how technology is advancing, how technology is going to change, you know, industries, economies. And it's a function of, you know, as Africans, we can look and reflect and say, at what stage are we in terms of achieving the fourth industrial revolution? A lot of us, you know, coming from, let's say, rural environments, a lot of our people are still stuck in the first industrial revolution. They don't have access to electricity. About only roughly 70% of the continent has access to electricity. So how are we going to leapfrog and lead this industrial revolution? And basically the conversations were around that. How do we actually enable Africans to be leaders within this space? Because as a young person, I don't want to play catch up to the rest of the world.
Sure.
I want to lead. And how are we going to reskill, retool the continent in this regard?
And we are very interested in hearing your thoughts on that very point. If you would drop us those thoughts on Facebook at Interface on SABC, or on Twitter at Tembisa Magele, or at Interface on SABC. We are back right after this. And we are talking about the World Economic Forum on Africa, which just took place in Rwanda, in Kigali. And we are joined on the show by Matsi Modise, who's the Managing Director at Simodisa, an industry association for South African entrepreneurs. And we also have in studio with us SABC Senior Reporter Nompumelelo Siziba, who was at the conference and is here to tell us a little bit more about that. So the timing of this conference. Look at the global economy currently. You've got commodity prices very, very low. You know, most countries are struggling. South Africa is not exempt from that. How did that plug into the discussions in the conference, Nompu?
The way it plugged in was that this is a perennial problem. It's been a problem for the past at least 3 years, actually, of low commodity prices. And so it's been a thing of how do we just get away from just being reliant on commodities and think out of the box and do more in the way that Rwanda has done it, because they don't even have any natural resources. So I think those are the kinds of conversations that have been had. So in the meantime, while the commodities can't give us the kind of leverage that we need, where else can we be looking to? And that speaks to things like diversification of economies and so on.
But what are some of the suggestions that were being made? Because these are questions that have been asked for decades now.
Maybe you can speak to that.
I would say look at the alternatives. I think our ability to create more enterprises, you know, how do we support small businesses? Rwanda has about 12 million people. Its average unemployment rate is about 3.4%. South Africa, you know, 54 million people. Our average unemployment rate has actually increased. It reached its record high in the first quarter of 26.7%. So it's saying something about our ability to harness ventures, to create employment, to develop small businesses as a continent.
But that's the problem. What's the solution? I mean, what were some of the solutions that you, as a young global leader, were putting on the table for those leaders?
You know, like South Africa is not short of funding, as, you know, my colleague reiterated earlier. Access to funds, our ability to actually fund small businesses. I mean, we have a lot of progressive funds in South Africa. Recently, there's been a 1.5 billion contribution by the private sector towards an SMME fund. So now a lot of entrepreneurs are saying, how do we access this funding? How does funding become inclusive? How does everybody feel that, you know, they're part of this movement? So I think our ability to actually subsidize our ability to build small businesses. I mean, it's very, very expensive to start a small business in South Africa. However, Rwanda has been very progressive in terms of the ease of doing business. It's second on the continent. Mauritius is first, third is Botswana, and then comes South Africa. So they can register a business in one day. So we need to implement structures that are going to support small businesses. South Africa is in a very advantaged position because it has all the resources in place. However, it's our ability to make it inclusive and accessible. That's a challenge.
And how receptive were the leaders to those kinds of suggestions? Because, I mean, that's not the first time that, you know, open markets and access to funding and all of those key things have been put on the table. How receptive were they?
If I may say, the leaders were making the right noises to the suggestions. Our Deputy President, Cyril Ramaphosa, was saying, yes, of course, we believe in the investment of small business and so on and so forth, and we're creating a one-stop shop as government. But when asked about the timing, you know, in terms of when that would be established and what it would entail, the detail was lacking. Apparently the minister in the presidency, Jeff Kadebe, is overseeing that, and he gave no timelines whatsoever. But we know that if that were to actually come into being, that would make all the difference, because it would mean that a company, big or small, would be able to go to this center and get all its permits, you know, whether it's water, mining license, whatever, from this one place, and be able to do all its administration in one flash.
Can I add on to that?
Yeah.
I think visa on arrival, Ghana is one of, you know, it's kind of a star when it comes to access for people to go into a country. I mean, right now, nobody really needs a visa in Ghana. When we went to Kigali, we didn't necessarily need to, you know, register for a visa 3 months in advance. We arrived and we processed our visa application and we went in. So there was no challenges. So if South Africa could clamp down on that, people's ability to come in and outside of South Africa, if we could ease that process.
But let me flip that on you and say, in South Africa, we have had to deal with an influx of the unsavory kind of people that we don't want in our country. Some of them using South Africa as a gateway, as it were, to other African countries. And so the government has been caught between a rock and a hard place, trying to keep those elements away. But at the same time, when they do that, people like you and you come to programs and say, no, 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 you're not opening it up enough. How does the government get it right?
You look at a country like Rwanda, whereby there's almost no crime. There's a lot of security guards at any given point in time. Everything is structured. You would think that it's a military-run nation, but people are very orderly. People are very respectful. And, so for, to come to your point of saying, well, how do we allow or not allow the unsavory characters? Look at Rwanda. Literally, these are on arrival, and there's basically literally not enough crime in that country.
I think it's a very, very complicated situation to be able to compare Rwanda and South Africa, because South Africa has a constitutional democracy. People are extremely free here, and there are always debates about how free are you, and so on and so forth. Rwanda, as you say, is very disciplined. It's sort of like a police state almost. And some people have issues around the fact that Mr. Kagame is the one who is the captain of the ship, and he steers it forward. But on the other hand, I kind of think that sometimes if you have that type of political system, things get done. Because if on day one you say, I want to achieve this, by day 7 it will be achieved. But in a constitutional democracy like ours, you come up with an idea, and then you have to put it out for public consultation, and then it comes back, and so on and so forth. And then it takes years for anything to get done.
So Team South Africa went out there trying to give that positive message, as we said in the intro, about South Africa being open for business. We are doing well. Bring your investments here. And we hear that we are now third in terms of being a successful economy after Egypt and Nigeria. How did that help or not Team South Africa to bring that message across? When people are saying, oh, your economy is not doing so well.
It's encouraging and disheartening at the same time. Encouraging, saying, guys, we are letting the ball go. We really have to now clamp on to how do we leverage off what we have as a progressive country on the continent. We have a lot in place, but how do we leverage off that, and how do we sell it to the rest of the continent?
But what were some of the key messages that the Deputy President and the other team members had to say? Well,
my understanding is that Rob Davies, the Minister of Trade and Industry, the way he viewed this latest development about Egypt now, having surpassed us as the second biggest economy, was, he was saying that, you have to really look at things like, the GDP per capita, the GDP per head, is that a bigger figure, And what's happened is that South Africa's GDP per capita has actually diminished over the years. So that's a negative thing. But at the same time, he was saying it's good news, because it means Africa is growing, and that, yes, we know that we need to get our house in order. We have policies in place. We're doing our best type of thing. Whether that, kind of meets with satisfaction, I don't know.
We'll have to wait and see. Well, we take another short break. Just stay with us. Welcome back. We are finalizing and concluding our conversation on WEF on Africa, and also taking your thoughts. To drop us a line on Facebook and on Twitter. So just as we are wrapping up, the IMF downgraded its GDP growth forecast globally, as you know, by about 0.5% per annum. Now, how did that impact on the discussions in Kigali? Here we are talking about Africa rising and Africa going forward, and the world economy is not playing ball.
I think there's an appreciation that Africa is not doing as well as it was in the past 10 to 15 years, for example, when it comes to growth rates. But there are specific African economies that continue to shoot the lights out, that are still growing above 6%. But when you look at the continent in total, it's not a great story. So with that appreciation that they're not doing so well, that's why the questions are being asked. What is it that we need to do to move forward? And does this digitalization, this digital revolution,
does it
hold the answer, the key?
But I'm really, really keen on that, because here we are talking about some African countries doing really well in pretty much, similar circumstances as the countries that are not doing so well. So what's the difference between what South Africa is doing and what Rwanda and Egypt and Nigeria or any other country on the same continent is doing? What are we not learning?
Sure, I think just being intentional about developing key areas within your country, especially the ones where you have a competitive advantage. Like, you look at Rwanda, smaller population, but how do we actually build the human capacity, or the ability to get people to actually get into these sectors? So it's being intentional about what is my competitive advantage.
But the government will argue we are being intentional. We've established the Ministry of Small Business Development. We've got all of these plans in place to try and develop black South Africans in particular. So, why are young people still so largely unemployed? Why are we not getting it right? That's the question.
Access to opportunities, access to information, our ability to integrate, our ability for young people to feel like they are part of the conversation, they are part of the economy, informing, educating them, matching the demand and the supply side of, the skills that are required in South Africa. I mean, there's a lot of, we're not necessarily skilled for jobs of the future in South Africa. And if we don't focus on how we educate our young people to be able to be knowledgeable in the STEM, science, technology, engineering and mathematics. Those are the key things. So matching the jobs of the future, or the jobs of now, with the necessary skills within our education system.
I'm somewhat encouraged by what's happened of late in terms of government, business and labour in the South African context coming together, because I think everybody has really been caught napping in terms of what's happening with the direction of the South African economy. There seems to be a serious concerted effort to make things happen so that tomorrow we're having a different conversation. So if this is being replicated right across African countries, that's how we're going to see the results. In the case of South Africa, if we continue to just continue talking, which is what we're great at doing, planning but not implementing, then we're going to be having the same conversations.
Back to the broader African continent, Africa's competitiveness. The demand for our resources is still there. It might have dropped a little bit, but it's still there. We've got macroeconomic reforms happening in many of our countries on the continent. The ease of doing business in Africa has improved in countries like Rwanda, South Africa also. But our ranking over the years is not improving as much as we would like it to. And that's according to the latest WEF report as well, an action agenda for Africa's competitiveness. How do we get that right? I mean, just some thoughts from young people, people that are in the field. How do we get this right, Nompu?
Matsi, maybe you can answer that first.
Matsi?
Sure. I think, as a young person in this country, our ability to, integrate and leverage off what we have, and, from a socio-economic or socio-political perspective, I just feel that we need to redefine who we are as a nation. We need to essentially stop inheriting what we have in the past and have a new DNA of leadership, a new DNA of educated young people that are actually going to take this country at the forefront. So, I know it's one of those very philosophical explanations, but as a young person, I feel like, well, we've inherited a lot. There's a lot of things that we're taking in from the past, but now how do we leverage off the human capital that we have already? We have a lot of young people that are educated from South Africa, from outside. There are a lot of people that have had a lot of global exposure. How do we bring that home? How do we then also, as a continent, how do we come back from the diaspora and come into our continent and essentially implement all that we have and all the skills that we have?
And as a continent, are we making any inroads, Nompu, to try and talk to that competitiveness? Are we making any inroads on infrastructure development, which is something that we're always moaning about? Regional integration, all of those key things. Are we really making any difference there?
Yeah, You've always got the dialogue that's happening, the conversations happening around African integration. Those conversations are always going on at the high level. And then you've got the conversations about funding projects and so on and so forth. One of the projects that was discussed was the Grand Inga project in the DRC, but that particular project has been discussed for years, and nothing is coming to fruition. So unfortunately, I just feel that across the continent, we do have these big ideas, but I don't know about the implementation on the ground and whether 10 years hence we're going to be hearing that things are actually happening and that we're more integrated. How can a continent that's so abundant with resources be trading at a level of 10%, whereas with other regions it's much bigger?
Right.
Yeah.
We can only hope. Ladies, thank you so much for your thoughts and your insights on this very important topic. And thank you for coming through to talk to us here in studio. That's how we come to the end of our program. Thank you for making the time to join us. From me, Simodisa, and the team, goodbye.